Let's talk now to Nabila Ramdani, who's a journalist specialising in the Middle East and Arab affairs. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Assess for us first, if you would, Nabila, the response of various governments. The Yemeni president saying he won't tolerate violence, as I was mentioning there, the Egyptian government appealing for calm, and, of course, news reports as well of that arrest in Libya.
Well, I think largely the response was right and proper from leaders across the region. And the point is that, of course, there is legitimate anger, what is a poisonous attempt to insult Muslims, especially since we've seen that happening before with the Danish cartoons, saga, and indeed French magazines also carrying out insulting drawings of the Prophet. Even though people have every right to be worrying about this kind of deliberate offence and indeed intimidation, it cannot be used as an excuse or a pretext for extreme violence, let alone a murder, as was the case in Libya. And let's be honest, what these leaders are trying to say is that you will soon lose the moral high ground if you protest against perceived insult by destroying property, let alone killing people.
It's interesting, a news agency in Egypt reporting that the Freedom and Justice Party, the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, is saying that holding peaceful protests being the key word there, against the film, is a right, even a duty of the Egyptian people, and Muslims and Christians alike. So an interesting statement, interesting wording there in that statement.
Very much so, and I think what's particularly interesting in the case of Egypt is that President Morsi is being particularly pragmatic. Let's not forget that his country is facing dire economic circumstances. Morsi is interested in restoring stability, not to drive away foreign investors, and it's no coincidence that he's in Brussels at the moment trying to convince the European Union to lend him money. He's also trying to secure funds from the IMF and indeed the US government. And that's precisely the meaning of his words today when he says our country needs to host foreigners and indeed tourists, meaning also foreign businesses.
Do you believe, though, that there's an element of incitement, if that's the right word, in some of these protests?
I think it would be very naive not to see that there are radical elements trying to make political capital out of the political vacuum in those post-Arab Spring countries, and they are indeed trying to exploit this offensive film to lead impressionable young people who are often involved in those attacks.
I suppose an interesting thing to look at is that there are so many controversial opinions and controversial views and images, indeed, in the world. And you were just talking there about the connections that countries in the Middle East are trying to make, new governments in the Middle East are trying to make to the United States. I suppose as they become more connected, this is an issue that the United States, the West, and governments in the Middle East will have to deal with, that potential for people to find things offensive.
Well, very much so, and I think what these incidents bring very much to the fore is the nature of the relationship between the West and the US in particular and the Islamic world. And the Arab Spring did an awful lot to strengthen perhaps the relationship between the Arab world and indeed the West. But let's not forget that there's still an awful lot of suspicion and indeed mistrust as to the role of the US in the Arab world, and particularly as it has proved to have ambiguous and, dare I say, hypocritical relations with, siding with Arab dictators one day and then turning against them. And that's very much on the mind of the people in the region.
Okay, Nabila Ramdani, thank you very much.